Okay, this is take 2. So we're going to talk about 4 topics. I'm not going to repeat this. Okay, we're going to talk about 4 lessons in evolution. Right. The first lesson is talking about how evolution is a very simple idea. All you need are variation, selection, and time. So I'm going to give you an example with HIV. Okay. So what I have here for you is a PDF that I downloaded. Yeah, where is it now? Did I just open it? I thought I opened it. I'm fine. Okay. These are basically drug resistance mutations. So here's the thing. Why would Stanford have all of this information about drug resistance and the types of mutations in HIV? What's the lesson here? Right, so you want to know if you have a patient and if you can figure out what mutation that virus has, that the patient has, then you know, okay, well, for example, if my patient has a virus that has the mutation here, M184V, so whatever that mutation is, then I know I'm not going to give them these 2 drugs because they won't work. But the idea here is very simple. The idea is, well, this is Darwinian evolution in action, right? You have these viruses that make copies of themselves. Then when they make copies, they make mistakes. That's the variation. And then when you apply the drug, any virus that has the mistake that gives it an advantage, in this case, if you have this mutation, these drugs do not inhibit your ability to make copies of yourself. Well, that's a big advantage if you're that virus. Okay? So this is the fact that HIV is very hard to pin down with a particular drug is a clear indication of how Darwinian evolution works. There's not one drug, there's a whole bunch of drugs for it. Right? And the reason why there's not one drug is because this virus is an amazing mutator. So it's gonna, come across a mutation that will give it resistance. Okay. So the idea is, you can only really work on what you have. So if that virus does not have that mutation, it's in trouble. It will get wiped out. So here's just a little schematic, right? So this is like antibiotic resistance. So imagine we have a picture of, these are different bacteria, and then we apply a drug. The only ones that will survive are the ones that have the right genetics for it, the right mutation. And then what you're left with is a final population that is very resistant to the bacteria. That's why your doctor says take all of your antibiotics. Try to wipe them out. Okay? Because you don't want some of them surviving and then mutating and running a higher risk of acquiring resistance. Okay? Alright. Now, evolution can explain a lot. We've talked a lot about examples of Darwinian evolution and how some things evolved. Like, for example, and here's just a list of things. I could have put more, but why do we have back problems? Because we took an animal that was supposed to walk on all 4s and converted it into something that is bipedal. And there's issues with doing that. The spine had to change, but you're still going to have issues and you're going to have back problems. Why does a peacock have a ridiculous tail? It's not going to protect it. Right. Because if you don't have the ridiculous tail, you won't get a chance to mate. So here are just some examples of things that evolution can explain, that if you took evolution away, you'd be like, that doesn't make any sense. Why do we have... think about this for a second. Some of the things, if we believe that we did not evolve, then you have to ask yourself some questions like, why do flightless birds have wings? What's the point? What's the point of that? Okay? Okay. We talked about even for example, why cancer can't be eliminated by natural selection. Because the fact is that, by the time cancer reveals itself, it's already past the reproductive age of people. So the way Darwinian evolution works is if you have a disadvantage, natural selection works on that disadvantage and weeds it out. The problem is if the disadvantage is not early, if it's after reproductive age, natural selection can't weed it out because you've already had your kids. When we talk about weeding things out, we're talking about reducing your ability to have kids. That's what we're talking about. Reducing your ability to have kids. So here's another one. There is a mutation in a gene called CCR5 delta 32. Okay? Now, this mutation, if you have it, gives you resistance against HIV. Now, this shows you actually where we find this, or where we find individuals that have this mutation. So it's an allele, and the frequency of that allele is very high in Europe. It's upwards of about 10 to 14%. But it's practically zero in other parts of the world. That's a good question. Why? Why is it so high in Europe, but not high anywhere else? Now, we know that the mutation gives resistance to HIV, because what it does is the mutation prevents the formation of this protein. It doesn't prevent the formation of the protein. Let me explain it again. It makes the protein smaller so that it doesn't get to the outside of the cell. It stays on the inside of the cell. The protein's a doorway for the virus. So if the doorway doesn't extend to the outside, the virus can't get into the cell. So if you have that mistake, mutation, then the virus can't get into your cells. But why is it so high in Europe? Now, no one really knows for sure, but most likely that virus gave Europeans an advantage to some other disease that was probably traveling through Europe hundreds of years ago. Originally, it was thought to be the plague, but I'm not really sure if it's the plague. But it was some other infectious disease that, if you had that mutation, gave you an edge, and that's why the frequency is higher. Because we know that if the allele gives you an edge, natural selection will raise the frequency of that allele. It just happens that this is an example where having that benefit, then in the future, gave you another benefit. Like having feathers to keep yourself warm, eventually was used for flight. Hold on a sec. We have a guest speaker here. Okay, guys, sorry. Let's, okay. Now, so we know it can explain a lot in biology, but so we talked about some examples, all right? But it's not always about gaining. I don't want you guys thinking that evolution is always about getting bigger, faster, stronger, gaining more.
I don't think that.
It's just sometimes it's about losing. Sometimes losing things, like in that example there with the CC5R mutation, like losing some of the protein is actually an advantage. Sometimes losing something is actually an advantage. So here is a picture of something called an ICEFIsh. Okay. Now this is the only known vertebrate species with a backbone that does not have red blood cells.
Wait, do you think that there's species
Both.
in the ocean that will have it found?
Definitely. Okay. Yeah, they're the same. They're the same. Yeah, probably one's a juvenile. Now, so this ICEFIsh does not have red blood cells, but here's the thing: in his genetics, in his genome, there are dead versions of genes that make hemoglobin. So we know that this fish had the ability to make hemoglobin, but was lost over time. Now, why did that happen? Why do you because this theme has come up before. The theme is use it or lose it. If something is not important, then it can be lost. Or you can argue if it's better to lose it, then natural selection will favor it. For example, like if you look at animals that live in caves, over time they will lose things like color and eyes. Because, yep. Now if you look up pictures of, because what's the point of developing eyes if you can't see in the dark? Right? So if you look at pictures of like cave fish, a lot of them will have no eyes because over evolutionary time they lost the ability to make eyes, which in that case is an advantage.
But then what do they call it?
Well, they have other senses, right? We have other senses. So here is a picture of, this information about two types of bacteria, okay? One of these two bacteria is an obligate parasite, which means that it has to be inside an organism for it to survive. Okay? The other one can exist outside an organism on its own. So one is free living, and the other one has to reside inside something else. Which of the two do you think is the obligate parasite? It's the one that has to live inside the other organism. Is the one that lives inside? Now this, if you think about the mitochondria, right? Remember the mitochondria? It's actually the same story. The mitochondria used to be an external cell that found its way inside a cell and then evolved into become the mitochondria. If you remember, a lot of its DNA was lost because if you don't need something, then eventually you could lose it. If you remember in the Inner Fish series video, how many of our genes for smelling have we lost? 60%, right? So 600 out of 1,000 about. So if you look at this one right over here, you'll notice that it has 1,600 genes, but 1,100 dead ones. Why does it have so many dead genes? Because the other one only has 6. So then you would think the one that has so many dead genes, those genes are dead because they no longer need them. Now, why would you no longer need them? Well, if you're living inside something else, and outside a host cell, then the host cell often does a lot of things for you. When we get to the unit on diversity of living things, I'm going to show you a tapeworm. Okay? And you're going to see another neat example of an organism that has lost so many things because it doesn't need it. Because what does a tapeworm do? It lives inside your digestive system. Do you want to make a prediction? If a tapeworm lives inside your digestive system, what system does it not need to survive? It doesn't need its own digestive system. It's using yours. Okay? Alright, the last topic, or lesson from evolution, is you can't get something from nothing. It's got to come from something else. So it can't be from nothing. And this is actually related to one of the questions you had on your test. So, for example, butterflies, we know that they have these beautiful wings. Turns out that the genes that make those butterfly spots are the exact same genes that build the limbs. This is an example of an old gene picking up a new trick. So, let's talk about wings, because that was on your test. So we know that there are genes involved in building gills, and we know they're actually the same genes involved in building the wings. So if you look at something like this, these things that are coming out of the body are the gills. Now, what came first, gills or wings? Gills, because life started off in the water. If it's the same, you can almost use your imagination here. You can take these extensions and you can just make them a little bit bigger, and you can see how they can become wings by just modifying them. The same genes are building gills. They're also building wings. This tells you that the wings didn't just come from nothing. They came from something else. In this case, the most likely scenario is they came from gills. Okay? They came from gills. It came from the modification of gills. If we look at our jaws, we know that jawed animals, and we'll do this in the next unit, came from animals that don't have jaws. The first animals did not have jaws. They didn't have mouths that can open and close. So here's a nice little picture.
Ew, is that a frog?
This is a frog wearing a snake coat.
What?
It's a frog wearing a snake coat.
Oh, I thought he was in the same house. I'm like, that's possible.
No, the snake is eating the frog.
Oh, I was
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I wrote the snake.
Now, what does the frog and the snake have in common? They're both jawed vertebrates, so they both have mouths that can open and close. And the jaws, if you look at the formation of jaws, they came from structures that we find in animals that don't have jaws. And when we get to the unit on diversity, you'll see that there are animals that don't have mouths that can open and close. But the structures that they have, the bones that they have in there, are the same bones that are used to build jaws. Where else have you seen that? Yes. What? What specifically in the interfish? Right. The inner ear are 3 inner ear bones. 2 of those inner ear bones came from parts of a jaw. So they didn't just come from nowhere. We talked about the fact that we can see red and green. That gene actually came from an original yellow opsin gene. You'll see in the next unit that flowers are just modified leaves. Flowers didn't come from nothing. They came from leaves. Leaves that were modified. We know the tetrapod limb came from animals that cannot walk on land. Here's another one. We have 13 copies of genes that make hemoglobin. Here's a nice little chart. Here are the 13 copies down here. They're found on 2 different chromosomes. These little symbols that you see, those little tridents, these are symbols. These are genes that no longer work. They're pseudogenes. But if you follow this chart, you'll see these 13 genes didn't just come from nowhere. They came from an ancestral copy that made copies of itself. So, they don't just come from nowhere. And the last thing is, I mentioned in the beginning, like, what good is half an eye? Right? So yeah, let me explain that. So there's a lot of people that say, you know what, I don't believe what you're saying, that, we evolved from this, and because if you're listening to how this works, right? You go from something that has no eyes to something that has a fully functioning eye, right? And it doesn't just happen in one spot. If you look at, for example, the formation of a mammal, you don't go from a fish to a mammal, right? You go from an animal that's a fish that has limb-like structures. Eventually the limbs get a little bit bigger. It starts to evolve a waterproof skin. It starts to evolve an egg that can, be laid on land. It starts to evolve. Like, it doesn't happen in one spot, right? So if this is the case, if it happens gradually, then what's the point? Because at some point you must have had an eye that was something in between not having an eye and a fully functioning eye, right? So we'll call that half an eye. So, like, what's the point of, how would Darwinian evolution favor half an eye? Doesn't make any sense, right? Imagine I said you only have half your eye. How's that going to give you an advantage? And here's the thing. If you look at it from the point of view of you, you're like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. But you can't look at it from your point of view. You gotta look at it from the point of view of, what are you competing with? Okay? And the thing is, half an eye is actually still better than no eye. It's like a paddle. If I said to you, I give you a paddle and you can row. Then I break your paddle in half. And I say to you, okay, here's half a paddle. You'd be like, what the hell? Half a paddle? What am I going to do with half a paddle? Well, here's the thing. Buddy beside you is in a canoe, and there's a hungry shark coming after you guys, and you have half a paddle. I would still take half a paddle, right? So here's the thing. Here is your fully functioning eye, bottom right corner, and these are different types of eyes. So here's a type of eye that only has just some cells that can pick up lights. Now, how is that an advantage? Well, how's just being able to detect light an advantage over? Because that would simply that would be like an intermediate, right? That's somewhere from we can't detect any light. A fully functioning eye can make an image, right? Like you can see because you're getting light information and then you're converting it into an image, right? But so you go from one end of the spectrum where you can't detect any light at all. To the other end of the spectrum where you can detect light and you can form an image. And then there's all the things in between. So let's look at this picture over here. This, just a bunch of cells that can detect light. How is detecting light an advantage? So we're going to look at something called a flatworm in the next unit. The flatworm cannot form an image. If you were to look at a flatworm and it was to look at you, it wouldn't be scared by you. Okay? Because,
What's the shadow?
Because it can't see you.
Wait, but if they have the light, then you see your shadow.
Exactly. But the ability to detect light gives them an advantage because they know if it's light, that means they can be seen. So guess what they're going to do? They're going to swim to the area where it's dark. So even though they can't form an image, it still gives them an advantage. Yep.
Can you see this cobra before you leave today?
Sure. So here's the thing. Even though they can't form an image, the ability to still detect whether there's light or no light is still better than a planaria that can't detect any light whatsoever. So there's still an advantage. So you got to think more like this. Being chased by the bear. Remember I gave you this analogy? Okay? You don't need to be the fastest. You just need to be faster than the person beside you. Alright, ladies? That's it for this unit. The end.